And I want to welcome everybody. This program particularly was planned to coincide with the recent opening of the ASM exhibit, Ancient Modern, Continuity and Innovation in Southwest Native Jewelry. We welcome Dr. Alyson Thibodeau, Associate Professor of Earth Sciences at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She received her MS at the University of Arizona in 2006 and PhD in 2012. And one area of her research has focused on using isotopes to reconstruct the mining and exchange of turquoise by pre-Hispanic groups in the Southwest United States and Mexico. Her cutting-edge work is helping us to understand more about trade networks on this beautiful blue sky stone that was so highly valued in the past and continues to be today.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining me. This is truly one of my favorite topics to talk about. I could talk about it for hours, but I won't today. I'll just try to stick to about 45 minutes and leave some time for questions. So since the end of my master's in 2006, I've been interested in the mineral turquoise, and I've been interested in ways to trace the trade, movement, exchange of that mineral across the landscapes of the Southwest and between the Southwest and parts of Mesoamerica. So the work I'm going to talk about today is really a summary of work that's been ongoing since 2006. And I'll talk about some stories that sort of have nice endings to them, or we have firmer conclusions, other work where our conclusions are less firm and ongoing. So before I go further, I just want to kind of cover all of my bases and acknowledge the many, many, many people who have contributed to the research that I'm going to share with you today. Too many people to name, and hopefully I haven't forgotten anyone here. I will be acknowledging some people as we move throughout the presentation specifically. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about the big picture. So in front of you, you see a map, and on a map there are tiny turquoise circles that mark the locations of some of the major turquoise sources in North America. And as many of you probably know, North America's turquoise deposits are largely confined to the southwestern United States. There are actually deposits that aren't shown here that hug the sort of southern border of, or not the southern border, the northern border of Mexico with the United States. There are also some deposits, or many deposits, that aren't shown up here in Nevada. But much of the work I'm going to talk about today, we're going to be focusing on the turquoise deposits that are shown here on this map. And this map really zooms out and shows the geography of all the locations we're going to be talking about today. So while the turquoise sources are that we know of are largely confined to the southwestern United States and parts of northern Mexico, we'll be looking at turquoise artifacts from locations as far south as the state of Puebla and parts of Mexico City. So this area right here throughout the presentation, this part of southwestern North America, I'm going to refer to it as the greater Southwest. So this is going to encompass parts of northern Mexico that are culturally linked to parts of the Southwest. And then, so if we zoom in here a little bit, we see the locations of these turquoise mines a bit more clearly. I've now labeled the names of those mines, so many of you might recognize the names of the more familiar ones. But much of the work I'm going to talk about today will focus on just a few of these locations, in particular the Cerrillos Hills, which is just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Canyon Creek mine in east central Arizona, and several mines in southern New Mexico and southern Arizona. So during my PhD, I became very interested in if there was a way, a chemical way, we could distinguish between turquoise from these different mines across the Southwest. So as we all know, ancient peoples of the Southwest used turquoise widely. I don't know quite what the earliest occurrence of turquoise in the archaeological record of the Southwest is, but by around 600 or 700 AD, turquoise becomes present in many archaeological sites. This is actually an image from my collaborator, Saul Hedquist. This is fragments of a turquoise mosaic. Here's a carved shell. It's actually the back of a frog, and shown with the turquoise mosaic pieces that would have been attached to it. This is another image courtesy of one of my collaborators, Saul, showing a more famous turquoise mosaic. And I actually believed ASM had this image on a banner advertising either a recent or their current exhibit. But just sort of demonstrating what some of these turquoise artifacts actually look like. Probably one of the best known archaeological sites in the Southwest where we find a lot of turquoise, or the turquoise has been the best studies, is Chaco Canyon. This is an image of one of the great houses in Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito. And several rooms, particularly the burial crypts, but from rooms throughout the Pueblo, back in the early 20th century, tens of thousands of pieces of turquoise were recovered from the structure. And much of that turquoise is currently housed in the American Museum of Natural History. This is just an image of some of the turquoise objects when you open up a drawer in that museum. The amount of turquoise is just mind-blowing. So we know that turquoise geologically is abundant in the greater Southwest, and archaeologically is quite important. It has long been thought, based on the geographic distribution of turquoise deposits, that turquoise from the Southwest was traded down to parts of central Mexico and actually further beyond. There's been a lot of research about possible connections between the greater Southwest and Mesoamerica in the past. How were materials or goods moved or perhaps traded during these between these regions at different times in the past? And many archaeologists over the past 100, 150 years or more have put forth the idea that turquoise from the Southwest was somehow moved, traded, exchanged down to parts of Mesoamerica. And so one of the questions I became interested in answering as a graduate student was whether or not some form of turquoise trade would link both Mesoamerican and Southwestern societies. So turquoise objects from Mesoamerica are actually not that common in collections today. A lot of the original objects might have been destroyed by the Spanish in the 16th century or looted. Many of the surviving objects that are encrusted with turquoise, or these turquoise mosaics, are now residing in various museums around the world. This is a famous piece from the British Museum, an Aztec or Mixtec turquoise mosaic, the double-headed serpent. But there are other turquoise mosaics from this region of the world. This is one that I'll talk about in greater detail today. This is a mosaic that was found in a cave in Pueblo, Mexico. It currently resides in a collection at the National Museum of the American Indian. This is actually a shield. It would have had feathers attached to the holes of the wooden backing. You see the holes in the perimeter would have had feathers attached, and you can see the design in the center. This is another example of a mosaic in poorer condition that resides in the National Museum of the American Indian. And so I became interested in, can we determine, this is a picture taken from Route 14 in New Mexico, this idea of a turquoise trail, turquoise moving from north to south in this region of the world. Was there a turquoise trail? And that was one of the main questions I sought to answer. So early scholars identified the American Southwest as a source of turquoise to Mexico. This is a just a screenshot of a journal article from the American Journal of Science from 1858, and you can just look at the title of it, the Chalchihuitl, which is a nominal word for turquoise, of the ancient Mexicans, its locality, its association, and its identity with turquoise. And this article was actually written with regards to the mines of the Cerrillos Hills in New Mexico, postulating that the mines of the Cerrillos Hills must have supplied turquoise to groups in Mesoamerica for the construction of turquoise objects. In 1915, Joseph Pogue wrote a treatise on turquoise. Many of you might be familiar with it if you're particularly interested in the mineral. And he wrote in that of the Cerrillos Hills in New Mexico, this deposit must have supplied much of the turquoise, which was so widely used in pre-Spanish times, not only in the Southwest, but in Mexico as well, for no other sources are now known at all adequate to account for the quantities employed. So the Cerrillos Hills, the mines of the Cerrillos Hills impressed many of the people who saw them in the 19th century through today. And the mines were so large, so big, seemed so important that they were hypothesized to be the source of turquoise almost everywhere. But there are some other large turquoise mines in the Southwest that were utilized by ancient peoples in the region. So this is a news article or the headline of a newspaper from the late 19th century in regards to turquoise mines in San Bernardino County, California. And you can see the headline reads, "Long lost mines of precious gems are found again. Vast deposits of bright blue turquoise that cover many acres of the Earth's surface." If you look in more detail at that article, you can see here again, there have been found the mines of the ancients, long lost to knowledge, and so the secret source from which the Aztecs drew their supply of turquoise is no longer a secret locked in the mists of the past. So pretty much every major turquoise deposit, when it was sort of rediscovered by Europeans studying or looking across the landscape, there was often followed by an article or some generating some idea that that mine might have been important in supplying turquoise to groups living in Mexico. So this idea that the Southwest was the source of turquoise used in various parts of Mesoamerica was really solidified or made the subject of scholarly research by archaeologist Phil Weigand and chemist Garmin Harbottle, who worked together in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to try to actually determine from a chemical perspective the source of various pieces of turquoise from around the Southwest and of turquoise objects in Mexico. And they published a series of articles. And I should say this was like one of the kind of early collaborations between archaeologists and physical scientists to try to solve a sourcing problem. So you can see this article here, the role of turquoises in the ancient Mesoamerican trade structure, which describes some of the ideas about turquoise and other blue-green minerals, how they would have been moved around, but in particular turquoise having moved from the north to the south. And this image summarizes many of their ideas. So this comes from a 1992 article in Scientific American, and it plots, you can see here, both turquoise mines in the blue squares and archaeological sites from which they analyzed artifacts in the orange circles. So Weigand and Harbottle analyzed hundreds and hundreds of geologic pieces of turquoise, as well as hundreds and hundreds of archaeological examples of turquoise. And they measured essentially the abundance or ratios of various trace elements within the turquoise. So they were looking at the turquoise from a compositional perspective, looking at what elements were present in the turquoise and in what abundance. And based on those results, which they further sort of refined using a variety of statistical analyses. They drew maps, such as this one, that show turquoise moving from places like Cerrillos, but from other places in the Southwest too, down to various archaeological sites in Mexico. And this is a fairly compelling image. The only problem is that they never published the data that underlied these interpretations. So although they published a series of articles, claiming evidence for this north to south movement, claiming that, the chemistry of turquoise found in Mexico matched the chemistry of southwestern mines. That's essentially what the claim was, that really there was no way to kind of check their work or have other people independently interpret their results. So in my head and in the mind of many other researchers, this left open the question of whether or not these ideas were actually valid. So that was a big goal, and a big goal of the work I'm about to describe was to test the idea that turquoise moved from the Southwest down to parts of Mesoamerica. So I assume that almost everyone probably sitting in this meeting knows what turquoise is, but I want to just briefly describe something about the mineralogy of turquoise. So turquoise is really kind of, when we use it in a colloquial sense, it's almost a catch-all term for a family of minerals that are all related in composition and structure together. So turquoise is a copper aluminum phosphate. It's hydrated, so it has actually structural water in its formula. But there are other related minerals that can look a lot like turquoise or co-occur with it. So there, when you see a turquoise deposit, not all of that turquoise might actually be turquoise. It might be also some of these related minerals. So in chalcosiderite, for example, iron substitutes for the aluminum. In a mineral called planerite is kind of copper deficient turquoise, where there's not as much copper within the actual structure of the mineral as you would otherwise expect. There's a zinc analog for turquoise, and so on and so forth. And I've just put some pictures up here of some of the geological pieces of turquoise that were analyzed in my research to show you how different they can look. And many of the pieces that I worked with, we actually checked or tried to get some information on their mineralogical composition. And it was clear that when we were working with turquoise, we're really working with this family of minerals. This is just an example of a turquoise artifact, and you can see the actual gradation of color across this very tiny piece of turquoise, right? It kind of grades from blue-green to apple green at the top. And that color variation is likely related to compositional variation, maybe more iron-rich in the greener parts and more copper-rich in the bluer parts. But this just shows that even on a small scale, turquoise can be actually very variable compositionally. So if you were trying to source this object, which part of the object would you analyze? Would you analyze the green part or the blue part? Because that color is probably a decent proxy for differences in the composition. And this led me and others to question whether or not using compositional data, trace element data to source turquoise, to try to characterize a turquoise deposit and then link objects to it, whether or not there was too much variability within a deposit or even within small hand samples of turquoise to really make that a viable method. So I want to give you a sense of what the turquoise deposits in the Southwest look like. So all the deposits that are marked here, whether they're labeled or not, were deposits from which I analyzed turquoise for my dissertation. So I was interested in, can I acquire turquoise from a number of different deposits and try to find essentially geochemical fingerprints that will allow me to distinguish one deposit from another. But first, let's take a look at what some of these deposits actually look like. So this is just a close-up of turquoise, a turquoise vein from the Sleeping Beauty mine. I know Sleeping Beauty turquoise is relatively well known today. I've heard the mine has since closed. although I did get to visit it when I was a graduate student, and there was quite a bit of turquoise in it. You can see here the beautiful blue vein of turquoise, and then you can see kind of a yellow mineral that's kind of on the edge of the turquoise vein here. That's probably a mineral such as jarosite or some other type of iron oxide that might co-occur with turquoise. But if we zoom out and look at kind of areas in the Southwest where ancient turquoise mines still exist, we can kind of get a sense of what they look like. So this is a kind of an image of some of the turquoise mines of the Alyson Hills. These are ancient, well, this is an area of ancient mining in San Bernardino County, California. You can see that the mines are just kind of pits dug straight into the landscape. All of these pits are probably modified by historical miners. So they're not totally ancient in their configurations, but we can visit them still today. Some turquoise mines are quite small features on a landscape. So this is an image of a tailings pile from a mine in central Arizona. This is from the Canyon Creek mine, which is on the White Mountain Fort Apache Reservation. And I have a few more images of this mine because this mine will feature later on. This is another larger mine at that same locale. The person standing here is Saul Hedquist, who wrote a paper on this mine and did a lot of the original survey work to interpret this mine, and was one of the people, or really the person, who helped redefine this mine's significance to ancient peoples in parts of central Arizona and New Mexico. So you can see here, there's a big cliff face. There's actually some caves going into the cliff where you can see the mining. So here's looking into a cave. You can actually see where turquoise has been dug out of veins. This mine is actually pretty interesting because while most turquoise actually occurs in igneous rock, this mine is actually in an ancient, a very old, geologically ancient sedimentary rock. It has a fairly unique geological context among all the mines in Arizona. This is David Killick, professor of archaeology at the University of Arizona at Canyon Creek. In some places, you can still find hammerstones. So he's holding up a hammerstone that he found as he was combing through some of these tailings piles. And you can see here some additional broken hammerstone fragments on this rock right here. This is a picture of the Great Pit at Mount Chalchihuitl in the Cerrillos Hills in New Mexico. So this is probably the largest single turquoise mine in North America. Its scale is fairly impressive. And even though it has been modified slightly by historical mining practices, pictures from the 19th century actually show that the configuration of the mine then is actually similar to today, suggesting that most of the mining in this location was done by pre-Hispanic groups and not by historic miners. This is Bill Baxter in the picture, someone who used to live in the town of Cerrillos and was sort of a fountain of knowledge about the history of mining in the region. This is another mine in the Cerrillos district. This is just a little bit northwest of Chalchihuitl. This is the Tiffany mine on a location called Turquoise Hills. So it's sort of a little separate knob. And so Tiffany and Co. Bought up a lot of turquoise mines in the Southwest in the late 19th century. They popularized turquoise as a piece of jewelry among Europeans, and a lot of mines now bear their name. There's Tiffany mines everywhere, but this is the Tiffany mine at Cerrillos. You can actually go underground. So this is Doug Magnus, who partially owns the Tiffany claim, I believe, and Bill Baxter, again, actually underground in the Tiffany mine. So all these mines have been worked historically and have been modified by people for hundreds of years since their original use by pre-Hispanic groups in the Southwest. This is an image of a pre-Hispanic mine at Ithaca Peak. This is in the Mineral Park District, so this is in the northwestern part of Arizona. This image was taken circa 1964, and you can actually see all the hammerstones in the image here. And I always like to show this picture because this was described by Phil Wigand as, I remember when I met with him in the early 2000s, he told me, he visited these mines the day before they were blown up as open pit mining proceeded across this district. So Mineral Park is one of the largest copper mines in the world. And so even though this region is still mined for turquoise today, many of the ancient mines were completely destroyed. So here's an image of Ithaca Peak in the 60s up here. And Phil Wigand described the adits and the various configuration of the actual ancient mines. But if you look at Ithaca Peak today and another location called Turquoise Mountain in the same district, both of which had evidence, strong evidence for lots of pre-Hispanic utilization, you can see they're essentially part of an open pit copper mine today. So one of the challenges in trying to characterize turquoise from across the Southwest in order to try to source archaeological objects is many original mines don't exist. Many of those that do exist are largely exhausted. So there's a question about whether or not the turquoise you can find there today is actually representative of the material that was extracted, in the, 1,000 years ago. So there's a lot of questions about, how well you can characterize some of these mines that don't exist anymore. Helpful to me was that Phil Wigand donated his collection. He drove around the Southwest in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and visited many of these locations and collected turquoise, which he donated to the Museum of Northern Arizona in the 90s, and which I was able to access some of that for my own work. So much of the work I'm going to share with you was actually made possible by Phil Wigand because he made those samples of geologic samples accessible. So one of my questions was, do turquoise deposits have distinct geochemical signatures? Can we distinguish turquoise from the Cerrillos Hills from turquoise from Canyon Creek, or turquoise from Canyon Creek from turquoise from the Kingman mines? And so I'm not going to belabor the methods we use to do this, but suffice to say, we didn't take an elemental approach to characterizing turquoise. Instead, we characterized the isotopic signature of certain elements within the turquoise. And if you don't quite know what that means, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this talk. It's enough to know that essentially we were looking for a chemical variable that we thought would vary between deposits for geologic reasons. So we looked at isotope signatures of lead and isotope signatures of strontium and tried to characterize deposits that way. I'm probably going to skip this slide mostly, but suffice to say the chemical or the isotopic variables or values you'll be looking at will be isotope ratios of lead. So those are the three here, and one isotope ratio of strontium. And in archaeology, these isotopic methods are two of the most widely used to source a variety of materials, not just turquoise. These are used to source all sorts of metals, minerals, teeth, bones. They're very, very useful because they're variable and we understand geologically the reasons for those variations. And we expect differences between one location and another based on differences in the underlying geology. This is just an image of one of my students actually prepping a turquoise sample for analysis. So I do like to make clear that the methods we use to analyze turquoise are destructive. So we actually have to grind up a small piece of turquoise, get a powder, we dissolve that powder, purify the lead and strontium out of it, and then measure the isotope ratios on mass spectrometers. And so we don't like to use this method or these analyses on any sort of unique objects. because it is destructive. So that limits sort of the range of archaeological or cultural objects to which this could be reasonably applied. So in 2015, we published the results of our efforts to characterize turquoise mines across the Southwest with these parameters. The samples came from Phil Wigan's collection of turquoise and from my own travels around the Southwest. Sometimes private collectors or other museums were able to donate samples to help us characterize turquoise from enough mines to actually make this archaeologically useful. So if you're interested in the details, they're all in this paper, which is in the Geological Society of America Bulletin. So let's just talk about a few of those findings. So here are all the turquoise sources we've analyzed using lead and strontium isotopes. And you can see that I've marked them with different colors here. And those different colors basically represent, if I can move it here, my next slide, different clusters of deposits that share certain features in common. And so rather than talking about individual deposits, we can just talk about them in sort of groups, like group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4 is not really a group, it's just one deposit. But these groups are in part based on differences in the geologic setting of the turquoise deposits. So if you just look at the strontium isotope signature of southwestern turquoise, and we'll just look at a few isotope plots, not that many. This is just the strontium isotope signature along the x-axis here with all the turquoise deposits along the y-axis, essentially colored and grouped together based on their geographic location. And you'll notice, for example, at the bottom here, that these turquoise deposits in group 3 and this one deposit in Nevada, which is Royston, have really different strontium isotope signatures than everything else, right? So they're actually, that group of deposits can be distinguished based solely on the strontium isotope data, which is pretty interesting. So if you look at group 1 and group 2 here, right, we see that these were the groups of deposits in northwestern Arizona, kind of this Three Corners region up here, and in southeastern Arizona down here. And what these deposits all have in common, why they probably have this particular strontium isotope signature, is that the rocks that contain the turquoise in this region are all of about the same age. So the rocks that where the turquoise has actually formed, the turquoise itself is very young. It's just formed from the weathering of these rocks, but the rocks that host the turquoise are between about 50 and 65 million years old, or in some cases very old, up to 1 billion years old. And we can contrast that with the group of deposits that have a different signature. So this includes the deposits of the Cerrillos Hills and all these deposits that kind of lie along the Rio Grande Rift Valley here, as well as this deposit in Nevada. And all these deposits are hosted by much younger rocks in most cases that were formed in a different geologic environment, and therefore they have actually different isotope signatures. So the turquoise weathers out of the rock and it acquires signatures from that rock. And so the turquoise ends up looking like the rock in which it occurs from this particular perspective. I want to move along here so I actually make it through everything. So in this sense, we can see strontium isotopes allow us to distinguish broadly between different deposits of turquoise in the Southwest. We can also look at a lead isotope perspective, and I'll just give you a couple examples of lead isotope variation. So the deposits in northwestern Arizona, southeastern California, and southern Nevada overlapped in strontium isotope space with deposits in southeastern Arizona. So if we look at those two groups of deposits in lead isotope space, we see that they actually have very different signatures that are related to differences in their underlying geology, which I won't quite go into here. So these two deposits that couldn't be distinguished in strontium isotope space distinguished they distinguish very well in lead isotope space. So the implications of this are kind of profound because we can define sort of the signature of what certain turquoise deposits in certain regions should look like. And that means we don't need to sample every single deposit in every single region to get sort of a comprehensive picture of what various isotope signatures should look like, because we can't sample some deposits. Some deposits simply don't exist anymore, but we can still make predictions about what their signatures should look like. So now we can distinguish between the deposits that sit up here in the Three Corners region and these deposits down here in southeastern Arizona. I also just want to show you that in some cases, we can identify individual deposits have unique isotope signatures that allow us to distinguish them from all other deposits. So if we just look at deposits in this group 3 here, and we plot up where they fall in lead isotope space, there's actually almost no overlap in this graph. So this is a lead-lead graph. You don't have to worry about the ratios on either side. All I want you to observe is that the different individual sources plot in distinct spaces on this graph, and all of the each spot here is an individual analysis of a geologic piece of turquoise from that location, and all the symbols are bigger than the errors on the analysis. So there's almost no overlap, and you can see here that Cerrillos actually has a distinctive isotope signature that we can use to identify it in the archaeological record. All right, so this was all a fairly long-winded way of saying that the isotope signatures of turquoise deposits vary geographically based on broad-scale differences in their geologic settings, and that some turquoise deposits appear to have unique isotopic fingerprints. So it becomes possible, we think, to distinguish regionally among turquoise deposits, and in some cases, to distinguish individual turquoise sources using these two isotopic markers. So then here begs the question, did some form of turquoise trade link Mesoamerican societies to southwestern societies? So what we need to do now is get Mesoamerican objects, turquoise objects, measure their isotope signatures, and see if they match the signatures of southwestern mines. So what objects did we try to look at? So here we return again to the National Museum of the American Indian that holds a collection of Mixteca style turquoise mosaics. I think there's 16 or 17 of them. This is again an example of that turquoise shield. And here again is the example of the mask. Now, as an analyst, right, the issue is no one lets you pull a turquoise tesserae off one of these objects, especially if you're going to destroy it. Luckily for us, these objects, which don't have much provenience, so these objects were brought to the museum in the early 19th century by a scholar named Marshall Seville. The only thing that's known about them was that they were collected from a cave in Puebla, Mexico. And others have written about the sort of provenance or, how these objects, what is known about the history of these objects, which I won't go into here. But along with the actual mosaics themselves, there was a small jar of loose adhesive with a bunch of, you can see here, very tiny turquoise mosaic tiles. So we were allowed to take 5 tiny tiles for analysis. Because they were, they were associated with these objects, but not physically associated with any of the existing mosaics. So this is my collaborator, Franny Burdan, who is a Mesoamerican archaeologist, and I trying to pick out which turquoise mosaic tiles we would actually analyze. We also collaborated with archaeologists at the Museo del Templo Mayor in Mexico City, specifically Leonardo Lopez Lujan, to get examples of turquoise mosaic tiles associated with the Aztec Empire and be able to look at their isotope signatures. So we were actually able to look at turquoise mosaic tiles collected from offerings within the Templo Mayor, or the Great Temple, which was the sort of center of the Aztec world. So in this case, we actually can place kind of firm date constraints on the turquoise itself, because it's contained in offerings that were associated with different building phases of the Great Temple. So we were able to take turquoise tiles from a variety of offerings that are all late 15th century. You can see the kind of map here and the locations of the offerings. And several that date to the very end of the 15th century and the very beginning of the 16th century. This was actually a burial of a canid. I don't know if it was a dog or a wolf, but the animal had turquoise ear flares, and the backs of the flares had disintegrated, and we were allowed to test or measure isotopes on certain mosaic tiles from the ear flares. This is another just example of the sort of objects in those offerings. We only use loose tiles that weren't associated with an object. This is apparently a turquoise bird from offering 1 in the Templo Mayor. And this just gives you a sense of what the mosaic tiles look like, their color, their size, et cetera. So we analyzed the lead and strontium isotopes in objects from both the National Museum of the American Indian and the Museo del Templo Mayor. And what did we find? So this is sort of one of our summary findings here. So here we're actually looking at strontium isotopes again, although the strontium isotope signature is plotted here on the y-axis. And the only important observation here, right, is that we've taken the turquoise tesserae that we analyzed from Tenochtitlan and the National Museum of the American Indian, and we compared that with the signatures of turquoise from the Southwest. And this is a box plot, so you can just think of the sort of extent of these plots sort of show you the range of values. And what you should notice is that the Mesoamerican mosaic tiles all have what we would call an 8786 signature that is lower than the signature of turquoise, geologic examples of turquoise from the Southwest. And that actually makes sense geologically, given what we know about the geology of Mexico. So we already see there's like this empirical difference in the strontium isotope signatures. And this empirical difference also appears in the lead isotope signatures. So this is just a lead isotope, strontium isotope plot of all the turquoise we've analyzed from geologic deposits in the Southwest. And the red circles here are the Mesoamerican objects. And you can see that they all plot away from the southwestern turquoise. So we don't see, a few objects might have a little bit of overlap. But for the most part, on both a strontium isotope plot and a lead strontium plot, we can show that the turquoise from these Mesoamerican contexts doesn't look like the turquoise from the Southwest. So where did the Aztec? So we're looking at Aztec or Mixteca style mosaics. There is some historical information about where the Aztecs said they derived their turquoise from. So this is the Codex Mendoza. It was a book created in the 16th century that recorded, it's basically an imperial tribute list. It recorded what provinces in the conquered provinces in the Aztec Empire contributed as tribute, right, to the Aztec elites. And you can see that several provinces were recorded as having contributed bowls of turquoise stones or turquoise masks or other objects that would have been essentially mosaic objects encrusted with turquoise. Here's a third province. You can see strings of turquoise beads and turquoise shields here recorded. This was material that was given as tribute. So the Aztec, at least the records we have, didn't record their turquoises coming necessarily from distant in the Southwest. They were getting it as tribute from conquered provinces within the empire. And these in green here are the locations of those provinces. So they're not particularly close to the Southwest. None of them are in places where known turquoise mines occur. So it's not clear if they were importing turquoise from elsewhere and then giving it as tribute, or if there were local sources that simply aren't recorded. And one of the interesting things you can observe if you're in this part of central or even western Mexico is that there are a lot of copper deposits in western Mexico. The same sort of copper deposits that host turquoise in the Southwest are also present in western Mexico. However, there's no record in the geologic literature of there being associated turquoise. It doesn't mean they had no turquoise associated with them. It just means maybe the turquoise that was there was mined out, was destroyed, those mines, and they were never recorded as having turquoise present. So luckily for us, the copper mines of West Mexico in particular have already been characterized with lead isotopes by archaeologists interested in sourcing copper objects that were made in this region. And so if we look at lead isotope signatures of copper ores from just one of these Mexican states that host these copper deposits, Michoacan, and on top of that, so these green squares are just lead isotope signatures of copper deposits from Michoacan that might have had turquoise, but we don't have any evidence of. This is the isotope signature of the Mesoamerican mosaic tiles we analyzed, and it matches up quite nicely. So we actually think the isotopic evidence we have suggests that wherever the turquoise came from, it probably wasn't the Southwest. There was probably a more proximate source that was being moved in particular into the Aztec Empire. It could have come from Western Mexico, where the Tarascans were located. It could have been traded in by artisans. But there's no isotopic evidence of it deriving from places like Cerrillos, or really from any mine in the Southwest. The isotope signatures of these objects really matches what we know about the geology of this part of Mexico and the isotope signatures we would expect to find if turquoise were associated with those copper deposits. So it's not clear that this picture of a long distance turquoise trade really rings true. At least as of yet, there's no evidence for it. I could put an X there. We've only looked at turquoise from objects very late in the late post-classic Mesoamerica. Most of the objects date to the late 15th century, but at least in that time and place, we don't see any evidence that turquoise was imported from the Southwest. So before I end here, because I'm coming up just a little over 45 minutes, I wanted to just spend a few minutes highlighting. So I hope I've convinced you that maybe this sourcing method works, that we can tell where turquoise comes from, but maybe we need to rethink this narrative, at least of a turquoise trail from the Southwest to Mesoamerica. But I also want to show you just a few examples of sourcing turquoise within the Southwest, and in particular, the importance of some mines, at least in our current data sets. And I want to highlight the work of some other people who have applied these isotopic methods to thinking about turquoise sources. So here I've just highlighted the location of the Cerrillos Hills and Canyon Creek because they're going to appear. So this is an image from the dissertation of Saul Hedquist. And Saul looked at, Saul's dissertation looked at turquoise from a number of perspectives, but he was interested in trying to source turquoise. And he looked at almost 100 turquoise artifacts from the Western Pueblo region. So this is, Eastern Arizona, parts of Western New Mexico. All these sites that he looked at had late pre-Hispanic components. So the turquoise objects date from about 1275 to 1400. And he applied lead and strontium isotopes to try to determine where that turquoise came from. And as he looked at these 94 objects and looked at their isotopic signatures, he identified essentially all the mines you see in this picture were identified in the assemblage, at least based on isotopes. However, if you zoom in and just look at these archaeological sites from another perspective, what his work showed that in the late pre-Hispanic Western Pueblo region was that 75% of the artifacts he looked at could be attributed to one of two mines. They could be, many of them were attributed to Cerrillos, and that you see here in these little pie charts in the light blue. And many of these sites had abundant turquoise from Canyon Creek, which is actually one of the more proximate sources here at the confluence of the Tonto and the Salt Rivers, and that's in the dark blue. So his work, really demonstrated that you could use this technique to source objects within the Southwest, and demonstrated within the Western Pueblo region how important both the Cerrillos source was and the Canyon Creek source. We've also looked at the source of turquoise from Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon. We're working on a publication of these data right now, but suffice to say that we do see evidence for the use of Cerrillos, or the presence of Cerrillos turquoise in Chaco Canyon, which is not surprising, but interesting nonetheless. And I've also actually looked at turquoise from archaeological sites in southern New Mexico with an archaeologist at UNM, Alex Carota, working on CRM projects on the White Sands Missile Range. So here we looked at turquoise from Jornada Mogollon residential sites, dating to between AD 1000 and 1450. And the sites from which we looked at turquoise are here in yellow. And these sites were very close to a source of turquoise that's often called Oro Grande, or the Cerrillos Hills, or the Cerrillos Mountains. We looked at both raw turquoise nodules and finished objects, and were able to demonstrate that almost every piece of turquoise that came out of these sites came from the Oro Grande source. And so that was a further nice confirmation that, what we think archaeologically speaking makes sense, is being borne out by the isotope data. So there's a number of other ongoing projects in the Southwest to try to look at trade within the Southwest at various time periods by various cultural groups. So with that, I'll leave it there. And I've put my email down here in the bottom. If I don't get to answer a question, I'm happy to answer questions by email.